What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Intro to House Hacking, or as the title shows here, WTF is House Hacking. So, my name is Dan Mackin. I work in the Denver area as a real estate agent helping house hackers get started and continue into their real estate investing careers. And joining me today is Conrad Carpenter. I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Conrad Carpenter. I'm with Canyon River Mortgage in Lafayette, Colorado, and I've been in the business since 2002 doing lending. And Dan and I are working together to help people understand how to do house hacking.
Yeah. So, what we're going to cover today, again, we're not going ridiculously in depth to house hacking. We're going over some things that are definitely important to know as you get into this odd loan things, property things, um, and further classes will go more in depth with further questions, other things of the sort. So, first, let's cover what is house hacking. Many of you who are watching probably know what it is, and if you're watching later, same case as well. House hacking is a great way to get into real estate investing without having a huge down payment. It's a surprisingly popular way to get into it, but it was not until 5 years ago that there was actually a coined term for what this is. House hacking is kind of what we talked about. It's going into a property with a low down payment. While many people think you have to go in and do 20% down, with house hacking, you take one extra step to make this a lot more possible. You own or occupy the property. So a lot of investors like to complain that it's not cheap or easy to get into real estate investing because saving up 20% down, 25% down in some cases, is not affordable for many people or achievable in a short period of time. Where with house hacking, you can pull this off in a few months, depending what market you're in, because I know some of you are watching from other spots than Denver. Saving up 3 to 5% down payment isn't that difficult. 3 to 5%, depending where you are, I mean, it's just a few $1,000s. Here in Denver, 3% is going to average you probably between $9,000 and $12,000 for a down payment. So it's just a great way to get started without having to save for years on end to get your 10% return on your money. Most house hackers we have will usually be making 20% return on the low end. Most are making way more than that on their cash. So, and for anybody to know, if you want to ask questions while we're doing this, we do have the live chat pulled up. So if you want to ask questions for me and Conrad, feel free to put it in the chat and we will get them answered. So, within house hacking, many of you who have potentially listened to Bigger Pockets or any of the other popular podcasts that are out there always hear that house hacking is with a multiplex. That's not always true, and it, again, is dependent on which market you're in. Here in Colorado, there are still people who house hack with a multiplex, but it's becoming increasingly uncommon due to cost and actual cash return that they're going to make on those properties, especially for the cost. An average duplex around Denver for a decent one is going to start at $500,000 in many cases. And so that is a lot different than, picking up a single family or a townhome that may start in the high 200s and go up from there. So you can house hack almost any type of property. You could technically house hack a commercial property if you were creative enough. But we'll go anywhere from like condos up through a fourplex. That's kind of the typical range that you'll see people pick up. And with each of them, they're going to have their own potential downsides. Starting with condos, and I know Connor could speak on this. Like Connor, condos have higher interest rates, correct?
Condos do have higher interest rates compared to an owner-occupied loan. If you're comparing the two, it has 3/4 point more origination fee compared to a single-family home.
Gotcha. So right off the bat, you're already spending a bit more. And condos are appealing because of their price, especially in markets like Denver. But they do come with things. They come with, like we mentioned, the higher interest rate and slight cost of the loan. And then they're also going to come with HOA restrictions, which increasingly is becoming more of a problem as associations are locking down their rental numbers. With the next step up, we have townhomes. They have similar restrictions to condos in some cases, where you will have rental restrictions on what you're allowed to do. The most common we see around the Denver area are restrictions on, like, you can't rent out portions of your property. You have to rent it all out as one together. And that can run into issues for house hackers where you're trying to rent out room by room. So if you're trying to have multiple roommates, it's usually not a problem while you're living there, but once you leave, it can become a problematic thing. The most common property you'll find out there is a single-family home. We all know what those are. You have neighbors that have their own yard. That's all separate. Some of those you'll have HOA. If you're in some of the big subdivisions that had been created over the years, like Highlands Ranch or Green Valley Ranch, there's lots of places that have HOAs. But the older the house is, the less likely the HOA will exist. And then, of course, everybody's favorites: duplex, triplex, and quadplex. Again, each market's going to be different, but here in Colorado, duplex is going to be the most common of the multiplex that you can find out there. Just 2 units, side by side, up, down. Each can be a little bit different. Triplex, for some reason, is pretty rare of the 3. It's just not that common to find, but I think it's just due to lot size and layout that it's not as common. And then finally, with the quadplex, quadplexes are usually the most apartment-feeling properties. Usually they're set up as like a 2 units above and 2 units below. Some cases you'll find them spread out across the lot, where it's actual townhomes, we'll call them, laid out next to each other. But overall, it's more of the apartment style is what you'll find most of the time. So ways to house hack. There are a lot of them. So, if we can go through the list, but realistically, we're looking at, you could do things from having a roommate to jumping up to buying. If you buy a multiplex, you can have a separate complete tenant, and they're not part of your life. You don't have to worry about them. They have their own place. Depending on the market you're in, again, if you're in Denver, room hacking seems to be the much more common method lately with everybody. It's the most affordable way to get into it. It's the easiest way to get started. And it's one of the best cash flow options that you have right now. An average bedroom around Denver, I don't really know anybody who's getting less than close to $700 per bedroom. $650 maybe on the low end, but reasonably $650, $700, you should be safe. And that's even with the recent coronavirus COVID things that are happening. I have heard from multiple people that they've had no problem getting room rental tenants. Now,
that's what I've seen on a lot of leases I've seen come across my desk.
Is all room by room?
700. Yeah.
Oh, and $700 per room?
Yeah, it seems to be pretty normal.
What's been kind of the range you've seen as far as those rooms go?
650 to 750 is kind of the range I'm seeing, just on the leases that people are doing when they're transitioning from their first owner-occupied home and making it the rental. They're getting their signed leases, and it's somewhere between 650 and 750 a room. It's not uncommon at all. It's happening, and they're having no problem renting them, as I'm seeing so far.
Has there been any exorbitantly high numbers that you've seen people able to command for any of their rooms?
Not that's coming to my mind. I think I saw 800 once, but it's not sticking in my mind too well. But for sure, the 700s was pretty common.
Yeah, I would say.
I mean, you could rent a room, 10, 15 years ago for $500, $600 a room. So today, $750 for a room is just nothing.
Yeah. And of course, there are markets that we're probably not really going to talk about specifically with this as far as house hacking, but like Boulder, the average room rental in Boulder is running, $1,000 plus per bedroom.
$1,000 a room, yep.
Exactly. So there are expensive markets that you could make sense with that. But of course, it's student markets, lots of out-of-state students whose parents are willing to pay $1,000 for them to have a room. So, if you have a family, multiplex might be the best way to go. You could do what I'm currently doing, where we bought a house with a walkout basement, and we're finishing out the walkout basement into a separate apartment. That way it has its own separate entrance. You can go in through that entrance, not intrude upon me and my family, but we can still house hack, have a nice place to live, and, you know, make a regular suburban property make sense for us and still have a family. So it's a good way to do it if you're limited by those restrictions. So renting the basement. Right now, this might be a weird one to talk about right now because we all know how much short-term rentals have kind of crashed over the past month and a half. But when the market isn't freaking out like it is now, short-term rentals in either a bedroom or a separate unit, whatever you may have set up, is a great way to house hack as well. Some people do it with their own bedroom and they just go stay somewhere else. Again, some do it in their basement. Some have carriage houses, if you've ever heard of that. It's a separate little home as part of your property. That's a great way to get a decent income from the property without having to do too much. Like short-term rentals, once you have a system set up, they can be pretty effective. Now, for those of you who don't want to deal with tenants, there is another method. Some call it nomad. It's quasi-house hacking, we'll call it. If you have the ability to put a down payment on a house and then pay that mortgage for a full year, but in that time save up for another down payment, you can do that, move on to your next property, and just rent out your first one. You don't have to have tenants while you're there, but you need to make sure you're able to save up in that time. Otherwise, you've just become another homeowner. And there are some qualifications within that, right, Conrad? Like they will have to make sure they have the rent. They'll have to have a lease signed for their old property to buy the new one in many cases, right?
Yeah, you'll have to have a lease signed before you buy the new property, or during the purchase of the new property. As long as you get a lease signed during the purchasing process of the home, you have 30 days to get one. And also proof of deposit in your account. So when the new tenant is going to give you a deposit for that new lease, you want to document that deposit in your account because the banks will be looking for that to qualify you. And it will qualify you on 75% of whatever the rental income is on that new lease that you got on the departing residence.
Perfect. And it's not uncommon for most of the people I've seen that go for their second, third property is they don't really get a lot of those leases fully locked down to exactly what they need to be until right before they're purchasing. So I know a lot of people will get the year-long lease set up right before they go for the purchase of the next house. And they may do month to month in the meantime. So other things you can do. I love houses with workshops, garages that you can rent out, something creative, because every separate space can be rented out if you do this effectively. Of course, you don't want to put a metalworking shop in the middle of a residential area, but you could have a big craft space in the backyard that you could rent out to somebody who does quilting, who does other things that aren't so audibly intrusive, we'll call it. But those are always great. If you don't know what to do with it, try renting it out to somebody and see what they'll do. It could be a couple $100 up to $1,000 depending on what the space is, or even more potentially. As we mentioned, some people around Denver know Craig Curelop. In his initial property, his favorite thing was to Airbnb his bedroom. In his one bedroom, he owned a duplex, and in his side, he had one bedroom. He'd rent out the bedroom on Airbnb and sleep in the living room. If you're up for that, then go for it. I'm not going to stop you. It's one way to get around the Airbnb rules of saying you can only rent out your, main tenant or main property, we'll say. But again, that's only for a very particular type of person. So if you're into that, great. If you're like most of us, you don't need to do that. And then, of course, there is, I just joked, this is like the ultimate house hack. You would buy a multiplex. We'll just call it a duplex in this sense. Each side has 4 bedrooms. So you rent 7 of those bedrooms individually, and then you do Airbnb for that 8th bedroom that you normally sleep in. And then you live on the couch and rent out the garage to a woodworker, or again, somebody who might be quiet, depending what the job actually is. So there are lots and lots of ways to do this. Creativity is your friend within the law, of course. You don't want to have a property make sense, and you shoot yourself in the foot. But overall, a big piece of house hacking is creativity is one of your biggest benefits if you really put it together. And again, as a reminder to anybody, if you do have questions as we're talking over any of this, feel free to put them in the comments and we'll get back to you on those. All right, Conrad, you're up. Loan types.
Okay, loan types. So we have our loan types listed as to like the most affordable ways to get into your home for your very first purchase, owner occupied. And we start with the FHA loan. The FHA loan has a 3.5% minimum down payment requirement, but it has some drawbacks. It's a great product if you've got a lower credit score, like 680 or below. We can go down to 600. That'll get you into a home. It will have a monthly mortgage insurance charge. That'll be pretty hefty. We'll show you on another slide here what that looks like. The PMI, if you put the mortgage insurance on the loan, if you put 3.5% down or less than 10%, the PMI is for the life of the loan on FHA. You can never get rid of it unless you refinance into a conventional loan years down the line. So it is going to have some drawbacks to it, but it will get you into a house, and you can use it on multiplexes. But with FHA, you can only have one FHA loan at a time. Unless for some reason you have an FHA loan and your job relocates you to another part of the state, FHA will allow you to have a second FHA loan, but just in those instances where you've been relocated. If we move down the list, the next type of loan is a home-ready product. It's more of a conventional loan product. The home-ready product will let you do 3% down. And with 3% down, you can either do monthly mortgage insurance, the monthly PMI, or we can raise the rate quite a bit higher and you can not have monthly mortgage insurance at all. As we were noticing just the other day, running some scenarios for this program today, the option where we buy out your mortgage insurance for you with a slightly higher rate isn't too affordable right now, just based on what the markets are doing. But it minimum credit score is 640. You can have a multiplex family, but with the home ready, you have to have 15% down to buy a multi-family home. And it can only be used for the first property. It's not necessarily that anymore. We've learned we can do it with multiple properties, so you could buy another property with the home ready. It used to have a restriction where you couldn't have more than one piece of real estate, but that restriction was removed, I think, in the last year. And then another version of Home Possible or Home Ready is the Home Possible loan. That's a Freddie Mac version of the financing. And the Freddie Mac version has a cool little option to it. If you want to buy a multiplex, it's one of the few programs where you can buy a multiplex with 5% down. FHA lets you do it with a low down payment, but this one lets you do it with a low down payment. So you want to get into a multifamily home, that's a good way to do it with the Home Possible. You will be subject to 80% of the area median income for restrictions on your income. So around $75,000 is kind of an average max that you can make as your income to still qualify. Once you get over that number, depending on the zone you're in, once you get over that number, you're no longer qualified for Home Possible or Home Ready. And then you have to, drop back down to the next one below, which will be a conventional loan. And with Home Possible, you can only have one Home Possible loan. Moving down the list a little bit more, the next level is, so you've used your FHA to get into your house, you've used your Home Ready to get into a home, and now you've used those two down payment avenues. Chances are you're going to be using a conventional loan next to buy a place, and that'll be a minimum 5% down currently today. Mortgage insurance, again, is optional. You can pay it monthly, or we can raise the rate and cover that for you so you don't have a monthly PMI payment. But with today's rates being so low, I would take the monthly PMI all day long. Lowest credit score is 640. You can do a multiplex, but you will need a minimum of 15% down to do a conventional loan for that. Owner occupied, of course. And there really are no restrictions to conventional loans. You can do one of those every year. So every year when your time's up, you've lived out the 12 months required for the deed of trust that you're signing at closing. You stay in your home for 12 months. You move out. You rent it out to other people. You can go ahead and get another conventional loan with 5% down, and just keep that ball rolling and accumulating your real estate. And gathering your wealth and earning equity and earning good rental income. People paying for your properties for you. The next one down is pretty cool. VA. If you have a VA, we love the veterans, and the VA loan is really simple to do. It's one of the best programs there is out there. 100% financing, and we can pay your closing costs a lot of times with that product with a slightly higher interest rate. Minimum right now it's looking around 600 credit score. Really, is the minimum for VA. We can go down to 580 or lower, but the pricing really gets high on those interest rates for that particular product right now. And then you can buy a multiplex with the VA product, but you must be a veteran to buy it. And then some veterans, in some cases, they can also have more than one VA loan. You can have two. So that's an option as well, depending on what you've used on your eligibility. I think that, Dan, does that cover that? Or does it get some more questions on that?
No, I would say that covers it.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much the gambit on loans.
What I would have is a few questions then to kind of get clarity to people. So, like,
yeah,
we're talking home ready and home possible can realistically, in most cases, only be used on your first property. Again, home ready has this change of clause lately that may allow that second one a little easier. But what would you recommend as far as like keeping your down payment lowest as far as order of loans? Like what would you start with, then go to second, and then go to third if you weren't a veteran? Because of course veterans, you guys get special cases with all these things. But for most of us who aren't vets, what would you say is your rate or your course of action?
I would start with home ready or home possible. You want to get those two out of the way because that's a unique situation where you can do 3% down on your first one. For home ready, you can do 3% down on your first one. The next time you do a home ready loan, you have to do 5% down. So you can only do that one time. And then if you can't do home ready or home possible, there's no way to do it, your income's too high, and you don't qualify for it, then go to the FHA. FHA is a great option to look at, 3.5% down, minimum 600 FICO. If you have good 700 FICOs, you're going to find the FHA prices out really well. It's very attractive rates and pricing. The PMI is not too attractive, but it's still a great option to get you in the home for low down payment. And then once you've used up your FHA loan, I would think, you move to conventional next. And if you're a veteran, VA, but you just once you've used home ready and FHA, just go to conventional.
And one point we should bring up too, because this comes up all the time for those who have learned about house hacking from other sources, is a lot of people say get an FHA loan, live in the property for 6 months, refi the FHA loan, and then move after 6 months. Anytime you refinance FHA or any owner-occupant loan, you're restarting that 1 year minimum that you have to stay at the property. So if you were there for 6 months and then refied, that means you technically have to stay for another year, correct?
Correct. And I think it'd be difficult to have the equity in the property if you're only putting 3.5% down to do a rate and term refinance into a conventional product at that time.
Got it.
It'd be difficult to do that refinance.
A couple specific questions that people have had. So does getting a loan to build a new multiplex, or is getting a loan to build a new multiplex harder than getting a loan for an existing multiplex?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. There's a term that you need to own the piece of land. I'm assuming there's a piece of land that's empty. So you do need to own the land outright. And then a good bank source for doing a construction loan, I would tell you, in Colorado, I know First Bank does them very well for construction loans, but it's a lot of work. They get you approved for construction loan, and you got to have architects and drawings and builders and designs and plans. But if it's handled right, I know they do a good job on construction loans. But it's certainly a lot easier just to buy a property with just a conventional loan.
Wonderful.
You'll be done in 30 days versus a year.
Exactly. And Anthony, if you have more specific questions on your stuff as far as being an architect, you can always talk to Conrad directly. I'll leave his info here at the comments section after we're done. So next question is, would it be advantageous to cash out refi one loan as the down payment for the next property?
Absolutely. If you can, for sure. If you're buying them with low down payments, though, you're going to find that you probably don't have the equity to get any cash out of the property. So on conventional financing, you can go up to 80% if you're living in the home, 80% loan to value for max cash out. If you want to get cash out and not mess with the first mortgage, you can go up to 90% of the value of the home. And that would be with a home equity line of credit. So if you have the equity, it's not a bad way to do it. I did it back in 2003. It was just fine. Took the equity out of one place to buy an investment property I wanted really bad because I was done with buying homes, living in them, and then moving out. I found my forever little house, and I wanted to stay there. Finally, I had to go buy the investment property with like 25% down. So I used a HELOC for my primary home to go buy that investment property.
Good to know. Awesome. All right. Any other questions about loans specifically here? We'll move on to the next slide, and of course, post them as you have them. All right, Conrad, let's go through some price comparisons here as far as why everything lines up the way it does. So,
Okay.
with all the different loans, the reason we try to house hack or try to convince people to house hack is the numbers are just so much better when you actually look at your cash on cash returns. Now, cash on cash return, for anybody who doesn't know, that is how much of your money you are going to make back after 1 year. So if you put $10,000 into a property and at the end of the year you've made back an actual like cash in pocket amount of $1,000 after all of your expenses have been paid, that would be a 10% cash on cash. And 10% within the investment world, especially with a rental property, anything of that sort, that's a very, I would say, common and acceptable number. Like if you can get 10% on a property, that's a decent long-term hold. It should be a fine property for you. Now, we like house hacking because the numbers can look a lot better. So if we're looking in this first one, as Conrad mentioned, he would usually start you on somewhere like a Home Ready or a Home Possible to get started. Those are the 3% most case loans, and they can move up to 5% if you're doing a multiplex. So in this case, we're doing a 3% Home Ready with the private mortgage insurance. We priced it out with or with it taken out, and it just didn't make sense. The numbers didn't line up right now, as Conrad mentioned. Back a year ago, all my people were doing this. They were all building PMI in. They were trying to do all that. But it just doesn't make sense right now. So you kind of have to take what the market hands you at the time. But so in this scenario, this is the same property across this entire chart. Every single person here is going to have the exact same numbers as far as like the property doesn't change based on who buys it. Of course, it will change based on how well you manage it. But rent is rent, expenses are expenses. This is just assuming the same person bought it and went at it different ways. So a $350K purchase. This is going to assume most likely in Denver a 4-bedroom place. And we're shooting a little bit low with the numbers here as far as gross rents, but I just wanted to keep it conservative. So a $350K purchase, that'll get you, in many cases, you could find yourself a 4-bedroom home, 4-bedroom townhome, depending. On a Home Ready with PMI, you're going to be putting $10,500 down as your down payment. Now, that's just your down payment. What everybody needs to include in that is you also have closing costs. So closing costs are the cost for the loan and everything associated with it. $4,000 to $5,000, I would say, is kind of the range. Does that sound about right, Conrad?
Yeah, 4 to 5,000. Depends on your homeowner's insurance policy for the new property you're getting. I know insurance has been a little higher lately. So that full year's premium is included in your closing costs. So
Perfect.
yeah, 4 to 5.
Yeah, so $4,000 there, interest rates, and again, these were all pulled yesterday, and this is all based on a 720 credit score. So we're not trying to give you rates from a year ago. We're trying to keep this as up to date as possible. So as of 5/13/2020, for a 720 credit score, Home Ready would give you a 3.375 interest rate. And if we look down here at the principal interest towards the bottom there, you'll see that comes out to $1,572 a month, and then you're going to have $88.58 for PMI, which for PMI, that is cheap.
That's wicked cheap. That's nothing when it comes to PY. Wait till you see FHA.
Yeah, if you literally look at the next column over, you'll see how much PMI is for the FHA loan for the same thing. Even on my current house, I have PMI on my current house, and it was a almost $500,000 house, and my PMI I think is $92 or something, which I was totally fine with taking. And that's the difference, too, of like there's not a one-size-fits-all for any of this. You need to go and talk with a good loan officer, whether it be Conrad, anybody that you're working with, and don't let them just pitch you on one option. Like, go through a couple different options with them and see which one makes sense for you. I normally was the type that said, I don't want the PMI, I'd just rather have it built into my rate. But when I moved to this most recent house, Conrad said, oh, no, it's much cheaper on a monthly basis to actually have the PMI right now than it was to not have it. and to the rate. So in the end, whenever the PMI piece is done, I will make an extra $90-something a month, and I was already saving money every month because it was cheaper. So on that first property, though, with Home Ready, we're looking at a $430 a month cash flow. And this, again, some of these numbers are conservative. We're just doing an example here. And cash on cash in the scenario would be 35%. And again, my screen is tiny right now, so I'm sorry if I get one number off trying to read this from the tiny screen. But FHA with PMI, that's the next one we're going to look at here. So again, FHA, there are cases where you can't do Home Ready as your first property. And that could be due to qualifications as far as income, correct?
Yep. Right.
So FHA allows you to go a little higher in terms of your actual down payment, or not your down payment, but your income. Your income goes a little further with FHA,
okay.
I guess is how I'd put it. So I've had a few people who... go ahead.
Yeah, you can go up to 55% debt to income ratio versus a conventional where you might be stuck at 45.
Got it. So it can just open up that little extra bit. Yeah.
Yes.
So I've had a few people who just needed that little bit extra. Like, again, we always try to push them towards Home Ready or Home Possible. But if they just can't, then FHA is still fine. It's at the end of the day, you're still getting your property and getting started. So if you have to go FHA, then go FHA. So again, same thing with FHA. We're looking at $12,250 for the down payment instead of $10,500. But that's just because FHA is 3.5% versus 3%. Closing costs will be similar. Interest rates just slightly higher in this scenario. But then if you look at the bottom, this is where it gets interesting with that is FHA, again, we're buying the same property. We're putting more money down. We're actually going to have less equity in the property too, based on how FHA works. And you're going to have the payment will come out. You're losing over $100 of cash flow every month just because of that loan. Now, again, if your only option is to use that, then use it. But between the two, everybody jumps to FHA first time because that's all they've ever heard. Don't do that just because it's the only loan you think is out there. There's other great products, and these Home Ready and Home Possible have been around for, 5, 6, they've been around for a while since I started doing this. And so I would say 90% of the house hackers that I've worked with have used Home Ready or Home Possible for their first property. So FHA I rarely use, which is actually great because for some reason agents hate them. They're not that problematic, but agents hate them. So we're going to move over then to the VA loan. Again, this won't apply to all of you, but it's helpful to those of you who either are vets yourselves or know vets who want to get into this. And when I say vets, I mean veterans, not veterinarians. So for veterans, if you use the VA loan, again, these can be pretty fantastic. You have no PMI on them. You can do 0% down. You could even have those closing costs built in, as Conrad mentioned earlier. So you could have nothing out of pocket. And so that 141% cash on cash that we're mentioning at the bottom there, that could be technically infinite if you put no money into the property, technically. If you just did a 0 out of pocket for everything. So there's ways to play it, but again, you have to look at what numbers make sense for you. If you are not able to save up a few $1,000s to buy your first house hack, like if you're not good at saving money, you shouldn't buy a house hack. We'll just put it that way. Or you shouldn't buy a property in general, I guess is more what it is. So anybody who wasn't prepared, it's always sad to watch somebody buy a property and then 2 years later, because they weren't able to save in the first place, they have a problem actually holding on to it and they're selling it off again. So I'm going to remove our faces here for a sec just so you can actually see everything. So CHFA FHA. So CHFA stands for Colorado Housing Finance Authority. So with CHFA, you're running into it's basically a first-time homebuyer program. I actually used it when I bought my first house in 2011. I had no idea what I was doing, but I still used the program. Now it changes each day, or they will randomly change it like month by month sometimes. It just seems like there's no consistency. So what we posted up here is actually a different loan with CHFA than what we used to do. We used to put up their conventional one, not their FHA one, because their conventional one was usually a little better. But they are not doing the conventional right now. With all the things happening lately, they cut that program off, and so Conrad and I threw another one in here. Now, the numbers look reasonably appealing. Again, you're going to put in $5,000. Your interest rate's not horrible. Again, your FHA, it's an FHA loan, so your PMI is going to be the same as doing a regular FHA. So I know people would look at FHA with PMI versus FHA on Chaffa, and say, well, the Chaffa one makes more sense. I'm putting, basically $11,000 less out of pocket to buy this property. Now, the one thing that we want to point out here is we still need to double check this with with Chaffa, because Chaffa has some programs that are very limiting to potential investors. So you would not, in some cases, be able to rent out this property legally through your loan. And this may be the one that there was a reason we didn't have one of these loans on the chart, and this may have been the one that was. So we can't verify while doing this, so just take that as kind of our input. There's some of the loans at Chaffa you can rent out. They won't tell you that, but you can rent them out, where there's a couple that specifically say you were never allowed to rent this property while having this loan on the property. The ones that were our favorite in the past, you could get the grant, which came with a higher interest rate, but you never had to pay it back, and you could rent the property out after a year, just like any other house hacker. There was another one that has what's called a silent second, which is a second mortgage on the property. You usually got a little more money for it, like they gave you a little more for your down payment, and you just never paid it, but if you ever wanted to rent the property, you had to pay it off. That was their catch. But again, they've changed up so much, especially in the past 2 months here, that there's been a bit of a flip as far as what's available there, so we can't speak specifically on that. So it looks appealing for now, but again, you'll need to check with Conrad and other lenders, whoever, to double check if Chaffa was the way you want it to go. And the way that down payment is so cheap is kind of what I mentioned. You're either going to get a grant, so they're going to say, we're giving you this much towards your down payment, or you're getting a second mortgage on the property to help cover that down payment. Hence why it's so low of a down payment on that side. Now, the reason this is so appealing, and I'm sorry our logo's probably covering it up there, depending on, I'm not sure if you guys can see it in the bottom corner there, but the final chart comes down to 10%. It's going to be 10% and $588 of cash flow per month. Now, again, 10% is not bad, and $588 is not a bad cash flow per month. Like almost $600 out of a property in Colorado. Again, we're just throwing random numbers out here right now. That's not bad, but you have to save up what we were looking at here, almost $79,000. And Conrad even priced this out. And the reason we have the extra $4,849 on there is because at 20%, that's the cheapest he could find yesterday within his products, right?
That's the cheapest we could find. And it's the COVID thing that's around right now. It's changed pricing on a lot of mortgages and because of risk and defaults at the bank. So they're pricing things out a little more hefty. Normally, you wouldn't see any points, and we just raised the rate up to 4.6, 4.7, and you wouldn't have that $4,800 charge on there. But right now, it's just in the market. Probably clear up after several months or once we clear out of this crisis a bit. But right now, they're pricing high.
Yeah, so you just have to be aware that, and even a little while ago, I started noticing that 20% became less appealing to lenders, and it started kind of 25 almost became the new standard that a lot of them were shooting for. So
25 certainly prices a lot better than 20%, for sure.
Yeah. But as for many of us and those who are interested in house hacking, saving up, and at least in Colorado again, saving up, $80,000 basically is not a quick thing. For some of us, that's, an entire year of salary. So house hacking is a great way. You could buy, actually in this scenario, so you could probably buy 6 houses, house hacking, as you could with just one 20+% down purchase. So that's why we kind of like to pitch this to people. Is your cash flow is less, but the actual return you're getting on the cash you put into it's much higher. And that's the appealing part to this. Your equity, yes, your equity is going to be lower, but the whole point is if you're buying these properly, you're keeping them for long term, it's not the cash flow the cash flow is part of it, but it's that long-term wealth that's a big piece of being a real estate investor. And it's the difference of you could go put $10,000 into a property in another state, but in that other state, let's say you're buying a $50,000 property in Missouri, and when that property's paid off, how much is that property worth? If we're just going by today's numbers, it's worth $50,000. So that means after 30 years, you have $50,000 in wealth. Great. That's still great. If you put that same just over $10,000 into a property here in Colorado that's worth $300,000, that still covers itself, still rents out fine. At the end of 30 years, you don't have $50,000, you have $300,000 worth of wealth. I would much rather go for the second one in the long term. So that's how I try to get people to look at this, is if you can buy out of state, you can buy properties elsewhere, you can buy them wherever you want. Just make sure that you're taking advantage of opportunities that you have here for yourself locally. And again, it doesn't have to be as much of a hassle as you make it out to be. Like, again, I have 2 kids and a wife, and we live in a house that when the basement's finished out, we'll have tenants down there, we'll rent that space out. And that will reduce our mortgage to a point where it was cheaper for us to have a nicer house than it was to live in a small townhome. So, we're willing to do that to kind of have a little nicer standard of living and still be fine financially. So everybody kind of has to look at what balances out for what they want. All right, let's talk about some myths. We can put our faces back in here now. Actually, no, because we're cutting off. All right, so we're not even going to put the faces back in. So the biggest myths that really come up with real estate or with house hacking, the first one is something that's been around, and it exists for a reason. Because it was true for a while, which is you have to be a landlord for 2 years before your rent income qualifies you or just qualifies as general income. Conrad, I'll let you speak on that one.
Right. So it used to be you had to have 2 years of rental experience. So 2 years tax returns proving that you had a property for rent before the banks would even consider any of your income. And that all went away in the last couple of years. So now you don't need to have any experience at all to count the rental income from the new property that you're making a rental. Right away, we could use the least income on the new place. And then also, I guess, should I go over to the truth side there? And
Yeah, you
then
may as well.
talk about, so that leads me to the other side. That's a lender specific restriction. Some banks still want to hold you to that 2-year experience. That's just their own personal preferences. But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac don't have any of those restrictions. And we have plenty of banks that don't have any restrictions at all. If Fannie Mae says we can do it, we just go ahead and do it. Another cool thing when you're buying a non-owner occupied property, I'm not sure if you'll do that, but if you end up buying a non-owner occupied property right off the bat, we can use the schedule of rents income based on the appraisal on the new place as income for the investment property without any experience, without an actual tenant at the home to help you qualify for the purchase of that non-owner occupied property. So that's pretty attractive as well. And I think that correlates to the bottom of that first thing where it says it will even count potential rents to help you qualify. So that's your potential rent on a non-owner occupied purchase.
Wonderful. All right, so one that we've already covered then is if I do less than 20%, I will have PMI as far as a down payment. So as we've proven with house hacking, you don't have to have PMI if you don't want to. Right now, as Conrad mentioned, it's not as appealing, but again, it's market-based. So just because you buy a property now and have to have PMI doesn't mean your next one will have to. You have to just gauge everything based on what you're currently doing and what the market is currently offering. So it's a good idea to buy a property that doesn't cash flow after I move out because I'm hacking it. Conrad, would you buy a property that didn't make sense as a rental?
No.
Yeah, I don't think I would either. So too many people look at house hacking as a thing of like, well, it's offsetting my expenses while I live there. But if it doesn't make sense for you to keep it after, that means you're stuck in that property with very little equity to try to sell it if the market doesn't go up. So you're not really putting yourself in a good position there. Any property that you buy as a house hack should make sense after you leave. I don't care if it slightly offsets your costs now. It needs to make sense after you leave. Even the one I'm in now, while our mortgage is fairly high, we pay $2,600 a month all in. The rents in the basement will be about $1,200, and upstairs we could get about $2,300 to $2,400. So we'll still be covered fine if we want to leave this house. We have no intention to, but if we leave, it still will be covered.
Can I add something to that, Dan?
Of course.
So if you're buying a rental property or you're buying a property and turn it into a rental, in 1 year, if you're actually able to make $400 a month cash flow on the place, that's absolutely outstanding to be cash flowing on a property you only bought a year ago. And chances are, if you're renting out those rooms, you'll be living rent free basically that entire year until you bail out of the house and go buy your next one. This is fantastic. It's not common to be able to buy. You can't just necessarily buy a rental and plan on it cash flowing these days. Homes are pretty expensive, but this actually works out to where you're cash flowing.
Yeah, it's just such a like I think the big thing people need to realize with house hacking is it's not that hard. Like it's going to be like there'll be a lot of similarities to just becoming a first-time landlord. You're going to have some hiccups, you're going to have some problems. But at the end of the day, for most people, it's really not that difficult. And once they get their first one, they realize, "Oh, I was making this out to be a lot worse than it actually is." You're going to have weird tenant issues. You're going to have things that come along with that, but you have to look at it on an hourly basis. That's the easiest way to look at all of this. Is even if you have room by room tenants, in your first couple months to get those tenants placed is going to take you some more time and get all that set up. But then as turnover happens and you're just replacing one person at a time, that doesn't take you that much time. And so if you're making $400 a month across the year, that's what, $6,000? Am I doing my math right here? No. So I mean, you're $4,800 for the year. So $4,800, figuring at the end of a year, most investors, especially on a rental property, put in 10 to 20 hours on that property for the year, depending on how much maintenance you do yourself, other things like that. That hourly rate is fantastic. I don't know how many of you are actually making the hourly rate in your job. If you are, congrats. But the rest of it, if it's something you can't just create in your job. So the best way to go about it is just to do it. If you find out you hate it, you don't want to do it again, figure out a way to be a more passive real estate investor. But for most of us, it's really not that bad, and you just need to get over the fear and get into that first one. So we'll go over the last myth here, and then we'll start answering some questions for those of you who are out there. So again, put any questions you have so far into the chat section, and we'll answer those. So house hacking is best executed with a multiplex. Now, as we've noted on there, it's generally true, but it's also dependent on your market. The hard part with most of the podcasts, everything else that's out there right now, is they talk about different markets. I'm not saying multiplexes aren't great. They're fantastic if you can make them work. But in spaces where the multiplex is overpriced and the rents don't command the number you really want, then room by room might be great. Or again, a lot of people are doing kind of what we'd call a quasi-multiplex, where, again, kind of like what I'm doing, where I'm making a separate unit within my own home that I can rent out separately. That's becoming more prominent. So there's different ways to go about it. Multiplexes are great if they make sense in your market. By all means, go for multiplex. Just knowing myself and multiple other agents who help house hackers around Denver, multiplexes have been such a low volume thing for us as far as actually making numbers work for people that they're just not something we generally recommend to people in our market. While I know plenty of people who, in other markets, that's all they buy. Multiplex, 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 multiplex. Here, you could be waiting over a year or more to find one that makes sense. So be aware of that, depending if that's what you're trying to go for specifically. All right. Let's see, we got our first question here. So what is the best way to determine return on income on making upgrades to eventually rent the house fully? Does the equation change for ROI, or is it still the same? So, I mean, Conrad, you could speak of this as a landlord as well, as far as like making upgrades for later, because you kind of have house hacked at this point. I would call it. You kind of nomaded a house because you're.
Oh yeah, every 4 years.
So,
Just
like,
slow.
if you were upgrading a house to rent it out fully, is there anything you would like specifically consider not doing or really going through?
Upgrading the house depends on the upgrades. It depends on the house, of course. I mean, if the bathrooms are just disgusting. That's not a bad place to make an investment, to make a real lovely place for people to have a nice bath. Nobody likes a filthy bathroom or a broken down, run down type of bathroom setup. Something that's nice and livable and comfy and feels sanitary. That's a good investment for that. Trying to think of other stuff I've done. Um, uh, you know, easy stuff, cheap stuff. Uh, paint and paint and carpet. That paint and carpet just to make a clean environment for the person to live there. That's the biggest bang for the buck. Nobody wants to walk into a house with carpet that's been cleaned and cleaned and cleaned over the last 6 years. And it's just a little nasty, and you really can't. It looks bad. Those are nice things to do.
Cool. Yeah, and I think part of it too, Diego, is I probably read your question a little wrong here, misinterpreted it, is like, and Conrad's points were good there too, as far as what you're actually upgrading, is that the ROI, I mean, the equation doesn't really change, at least in my mind, as far as calculating what the ROI is on making upgrades. Um, if
I
you,
don't even look at it myself.
yeah, I mean, so many people
I
listen
want
to
a
you, so
nice place for my tenant.
yes, it's. I think that's what more landlords need to look at is like, are you trying to make a nice place to live, or are you just trying to make a place that you can rent out? Most like, if more of us went for having a nice place to rent, we'd get better tenants in the first place. Um, so yeah, when making that calculation, it's not really much different. You're not going to be upgrading a property any differently when you're house hacking versus if you were just going to be a landlord, because the end tenant type is going to be the same no matter which way you do it. So whatever way you've gone in and what type of tenant you're pursuing, whether it be a room by room tenant type or a full family, or just renting the whole property out together for following fair housing. The best way to go at it is just what type of tenant are you pursuing? Upgrade the place specifically to that. Um, and be aware that in many of these places, especially room by room, like you want to have it present nice, but it's not, you don't want to have like the highest class place in most of these room by rooms because the type of people who are going in there aren't looking for top dollar stuff. They're looking for a nice, comfortable, well kept property to live in that's convenient to what they need to do and is affordable. So there's, you know, always rehab and upgrade based on tenant type that you were pursuing.
Yeah, Dan, that's true. And if you remember my other rental here in town that I updated about 7 years ago, um, it was 1980s inside that house. It was all almond, everything. It was carpet. It was an FHA HUD purchase I did back in '93, and I never did any updates to it since then. So it was pretty plain Jane looking. Um, but after a while, I just couldn't stand walking in the house anymore and seeing 1980 in there anymore. And I ended up ripping the whole place out and laying down the hardwoods. I mean, it was over the top. So about 70 grand worth of upgrades, which you think, wow, that's crazy. But ended up doing really nice maple cabinetry in the kitchen, granite countertops, hardwood floors, top to bottom, all new doors, all new hardware, all new plumbing, all new baths, all new tile, but and eventually all new windows. The ultimately the type of tenant I started getting seemed to be there's just a different level up from what I was getting before. I would get somebody that wanted everything perfect and lovely, and they were willing to pay for it. And I never had a problem getting. I mean, we ended up going $1,000 more a month on the house based on the market and based on the type of home, and no problem renting it at all every time, and always finding a very nice, clean type of tenant. One that cares about where they live and likes things nice and clean is what I've noticed. When they walk into a nice home, they see a nice house, they can tell you care about it. So it's not like walking into an old rundown place where people go, "Well, this guy obviously doesn't care about his home." They walk into this kind of a home and they go, "Oh, wow, this is really exceptional. We need to take care of it because this is really lovely." That's the mentality for doing that, and it worked out really well. It paid for itself, you know.
Exactly. And even now, I'm in the middle of rehabbing a house hack with my brother. I partnered up with him to purchase his first property, which is for those of you who don't want to house hack yourselves or you don't think it's an option for you. If you have family, you can house hack with them in certain situations. So he was my sibling. I was able to co-sign on the loan with him and contribute part of the down payment. And so we bought this property together. And so right now we're in the middle of fixing it up for him and his roommates to move in July, just to get everything ready. And again, we're definitely making it a lot nicer than it was. As with any property, if anybody out there doesn't know this, every property you buy, you're going to find something you didn't expect. It's just the way properties work. Unless you're new build, and even then sometimes it happens. But, we're going through cleaning up the whole place, repainting all of it, making it look nicer. One tip, if you find a place that has wallpaper everywhere that's underneath the paint, that's going to be a huge pain in the butt to make it look good. We are finding that out with a lot of rooms in this property. But for reference, I'll give you guys numbers on what that property looks like right now, as far as what rent should be, what we purchased it for, all that, just to give you a reference of some things that people are buying around here in Denver. So we paid $276,000 for it. Our total out-of-pocket cost to purchase was $12,000. We had some of those closing costs covered by lender credits. We had another portion covered by seller credits as well. The seller gave us some money. And within that, we also got the full sewer line replaced, got that all covered. The total rehab, we're doing most of the work ourselves, but I'm teaching my brother how to do this. So hence why we're doing most of the labor ourselves. It will be about $2,000 to $3,000 of parts or, materials, we'll call it. And gross rents, and these have been proven by friends of ours within that same complex, are about $2,800 for the whole unit. And that's renting by the room. So it averages out to about $700 a room, as Conrad has mentioned, is kind of the average he sees floating around. It's one room for $650, two for $700 each, and then the last one that's the nicest for $750. So on this whole property, our base cost, which is PITI and HOA, we're paying $1,850 a month. So we have a $950 gap between PITI and HOA all the way up to our gross rents that we'll be making on it. So not a bad purchase at all. I mean, it's not the prettiest property at the end of the world. They're very boxy. If you go to the outside, they're not perfect. But tenants are looking for a nice place to live. If they go inside, it's a nice place. They have a nice room. They have a nice bathroom. That's what we're shooting for. We're just trying to make it a nice, presentable place that they can be comfortable in, and that's convenient to where they need to be. So, it's close to a bus station. Across the street, for anybody who wants reference, is downtown Westminster, which, if anybody's lived here long enough, was Westminster Mall back in the 90s and early 2000s, for those of us who grew up around here. So it was a great purchase for us. In the long term, we'll see how it all goes. But, my brother's 24 years old. He's now into his first property. So, if you don't have to be older to get into this. Starting in your early 20s is great. Starting in your 30s is great. So it's always a good time to do it. My mom just turned 60 last year. They bought their first house hack 2 years ago. They bought a place with an apartment in the basement. So it doesn't matter what age you are. If it makes sense for you, just do it. For my parents' case, their retirement, like all their base housing costs when they retire, are completely covered by just renting out their basement apartment. And they have a very nice house. That's what I think people have to realize with this, is you don't have to buy a crappy property to make this work. You can buy a nice property and make this work if you play your cards right. It just all depends on what your end goals are. And as Conrad mentioned, I always like showing this, and we'll make the view a little bigger here just to give everybody reference, hi everybody. So part of what's going to pitch us to our tenants is this is the view out the back.
That's nice.
So I was going to show everybody, it looked kind of like Mordor earlier, but this, our tenants are just 20 feet below when the unit's all done, and they'll get a very similar view to this. Now, most people wouldn't look at that as a typical house hack, but the numbers make sense for us, and it will attract better people because we're not saying, hey, come live in a basement. We're saying, hey, we have a very nice place. Come stay here, have a view, enjoy the view, be part of it. So you just always look at what your best options are for your area, what you're looking for, because there's a lot of variety as far as what you want. So I hope everybody got some good info from this. Conrad, do you have any more to add before we close it up here? And again, if anybody does have questions, I'll let it run for another minute or two here because there's a 30-second delay as far as our stream goes. So post any last-minute questions you got here. We'll hold on for a couple minutes. But otherwise, if you are done, thanks again for joining us. And again, if you have questions, you can reach out to myself. My email is dan@redhawkteam.com. You can also find me on BiggerPockets pretty easily. And then Conrad, I'll let you give your info.
Yeah, well, I got one more thing.
Oh, go for
We
it.
haven't talked about it, Dan, but have you talked to anybody about executive rentals? So, pre-furnishing a little area, and it's all set up for somebody to come live, like a nurse for nurses or traveling people for business when they're in town. Have you
I
said
have
it?
not.
You haven't done
Well,
anything along those lines?
I have not had anybody specifically do that. Anybody who ended up going that route. So I'll let you talk about it a little bit.
Well, when I moved to Boulder, about way back in '93, I had to find a place to stay, and finding the places to stay, I ended up getting like an executive rental. So it was somebody's basement in a bi-level, fully furnished, kitchenette, well, actually a full kitchen, bath, shower, bedroom, living room. It was lovely, but at the time it was ridiculously expensive. It was like $1,000 a month, which is just for this little flat. But I mean, that was in '93. Today, I can only imagine doing those executive rentals if you have a nice little layout that you can rent out. Like I have here in my home, I have a little downstairs. There's a living room, there's a bedroom, a separate bath and shower. It's kind of walled off from the rest of the house, and it has a separate entrance from the back of the house. So you can enter from outside, and a wet bar, and you can put a hot plate and a fridge in there. And I bet you could get 1,500 or more a month for a rental like that. So that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, it's like a simple thing to put together. And that's one of the things we've considered for our basement area. Like we know we have lots of options. We're just going to try them. Whichever one works, we'll stick with. If in the end it means tenant, great. If executive works, great. If short term works, great. Obviously, short term right now is not the most appealing for most places just because it's low demand. But again, you take the market as it comes. The one thing I would caution people to is don't buy a property based on only having one potential way to rent it. If it only makes sense renting by the room and you have to rent it out in a different way, whether just because of your bad planning or just, it was a little too tedious for you, you don't want to be stuck with a property that you can only do one option with. You want to have as many options as possible so that you can be flexible and kind of float along with whatever's coming up right now. If you were purely in the Airbnb space right now, I'm assuming many of you have read articles about there's a ton of properties being unloaded in vacation markets because people can't afford to pay for their Airbnbs or their short-term rentals, whatever you want to call them. So, flexibility is great. Do whatever options you can. Executive rentals, even for full properties. Conrad mentioned portions of properties. There's people who their entire portfolio is executive rentals for corporate things within an entire house. So they buy in areas that are near big job hubs, places that hire a lot of contractors that they bring into town, other things like that, and they that company. So they'll go to that company, and the company will rent the whole property from them, and they take care of putting the tenants in. So you're not dealing with who's coming in, who's coming out. The company says, hey, we've got contractors coming. We will be the ones leasing it, and we will place the tenants within there underneath our lease. So again, as the kind of general consensus of all this is, there is a ton of creativity that you can do within this. This is a great way to get started. I think that's it, Conrad, right?
Yeah, and you have a roof over your head the whole time. Someone's paying your rent, and you're living in the house. It's a nice option, and hopefully you all get along. And I found pretty good roommates over the years. It's worked out really well.
Exactly. So I hope this helps those of you who are considering doing it. And again, we kind of went over some basics to start today. We'll do a further follow-up one as far as running numbers more and getting ideas on properties, things like that, a little more in depth here later. But we just wanted to give everybody a quick intro and get you started here. So thanks again for chiming in with us. And like I said, reach out if you have any questions. Conrad, I never let you get your info in there, so give everybody your info before we head out here.
Oh, yeah, I get to give my info. So Conrad Carpenter, Canyon River Mortgage in Lafayette, Colorado. But just since 2002. It's getting kind of old on this. But we've been in business since 2006 as Canyon River Mortgage. And if you need any questions or need anything at all, just Google Conrad Carpenter. I pop up all over Google, mostly good things. And then you can find me really easy, my contact information. I'm easy to get a hold of if you just Google Conrad Carpenter or Canyon River Mortgage. So love to answer any questions that you have at any time. That's all I do all day. So feel free to pick my brain. And feel free to pick Dan's brain.
Yeah, we both have info. We'll usually bounce ideas off each other too. So if you ever have a
Both
question
have
that you're trying to
brains.
figure out, I should probably cut my face since you're not just staring at just Conrad, like kind of hanging out while
Oh,
I'm
thank
talking.
you.
Yeah.